Welcome to the Last Line of Defense. I'm Seth Jones, your host and president of the Defense and Security Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I'm joined today and honored to have on David Shedd, among other activities in his past, former deputy director and acting director of the Defense Intelligence Agency and author of the superb book, The Great Heist, China's Epic Campaign to Steal America's Secrets. David, great to have you on, and thanks for all the great work you've done on this and plenty of other subjects.
Thank you, Seth. I'm delighted to be with you and joining your audience as well today. And I'm appreciative of CSIS as well in terms of having this podcast in which we're going to talk about China.
Yes. The big question that I want to drill down on is to better understand the espionage threat from China to the U.S. homeland and to U.S. companies, universities, government agencies, and other audiences in the U.S. And I wanted to start off at the 30,000-foot level, if I can. Over the last couple of months, there have been a number of big headliners, espionage cases, and other cases that have hit the news. The conviction of a former active duty military member accused of selling Navy secrets to Chinese intelligence, the arrest of Chinese nationals that were accused of trying to recruit active duty service members as intelligence assets, some of the smuggling of toxins into the U.S. allegedly that we've seen. And then more recently, it does look like reports coming out of Congress of Chinese hacking yet again of systems of U.S. congressional committee staff, including tied to China's Salt Typhoon, which we'll talk in more detail about Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, and others. So, but if I could get you to sort of give the big sort of your strategic assessment as the threat level that the Chinese pose inside of the United States.
We are seeing the manifestation of an enormous investment by the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, under Xi Jinping since 2013, in which the Ministry of State Security has doubled in size. And just to give you the scope of the Ministry of State Security, it is the combination of the CIA, the FBI, the National Security Agency, the National Geospatial Agency, and all the cyber components that enable that, of which we'll talk about Salt Typhoon and perhaps touch on Volt Typhoon as well. Tongue twister there. And so what you're seeing is a highly capable service with increasing capabilities and resources to go after this in what is known as Bureau 18. Out of 18 bureaus that they have, they save the best for last, which is entirely focused on the United States. And this would be a combination of human intelligence operations, the kind of recruitments that you described in these recent arrests and or convictions that have occurred that make the headlines from time to time and have been increasingly breaking news, as was the case out of the research at University of Michigan, where the pathogens were caught by a boyfriend and girlfriend coming back to the U.S., bringing this back from China. And so we have an unfettered, in terms of ethics or any other constraints to it, Ministry of State Security focused on the United States with capabilities that run the full spectrum, as I noted, from human operations to cyber and all the rest, of which they are clearly treating the United States as an adversary when it comes to going after both our secrets in terms of capabilities and technology and innovation, but also our data.
Yeah. So, I think it'd be helpful to drill down a little bit, and I'll give you the choice of which case or cases you want to highlight somewhat recently. But can you provide a little bit of an illustration, almost at the tactical or operational levels, of what some of these Chinese cases have looked like in the U.S.?
Well, you mentioned the U.S. Navy individual in terms of the sailor in San Diego. This is the case of Jing Wei, in which he was now convicted and sentenced in December, so just last month, after taking photographs and removing data in San Diego from the Navy base there. I would call that a rather traditional type of operation. The one, and it's far less clear as to what the two Chinese advanced PhD students were doing by bringing in this pathogen about mid-year last year, in early June of last year, is a very different type of case. Was this then to do research? And I will tell you, if it's an open investigation and in terms of looking for a conviction, the FBI is not going to give you much information about the case now. But it would appear that they had brought that in order to do additional scientific research on it, but very, very dangerous to bringing in this particular fungus into it. Other cases have involved stealing seeds from Monsanto's, literally digging them out of the ground in Iowa farms so that they can replicate that. And what they do is, when I'm speaking they being the Chinese, they bypass all the research and development associated with it. Then you have, of course, the kind of cyber attacks that have been occurring through the typhoons, a name given to it by Microsoft. That's where the typhoon family names come from, of which now we have an additional 7 campaigns going on in the cyber arena that are concurrent to the two typhoons that we've talked about, both Salt and Volt.
So I wonder if you could spend a moment first providing an overview of Salt Typhoon. I mean, it is, as you mentioned, Microsoft. It's using the Microsoft name for them, an advanced persistent threat actor, but from the MSS, the Ministry of State Security, and then Volt Typhoon, which has also gone by many other names. I've noticed
Yes.
Vanguard Panda, Bronze Silhouette. But can you tell us a little bit more specifically about what Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon refer to? Because it's not uncommon for them to be mentioned in press stories about Chinese cyber activities.
Right. First and foremost, we need to understand that in both instances, these are campaigns. They're not single events. Secondly, in the case of Salt Typhoon and to a degree, Volt Typhoon are taking place in no less already identified 80 countries. This is not just inside the United States. And they're global in nature. And thirdly, you need to understand that these are both intended for data or information collection, proprietary and or classified if they can break through the firewalls, and then embedding, in the case of Volt Typhoon, embedding capabilities that allow for kill switches inside our infrastructure. So Salt Typhoon has been focused principally on our telecommunications infrastructure. Think of Verizon, AT&T, and others, about a half dozen to 8 of them that were penetrating, getting the metadata on yours and my communications through these TCOM providers, as we would know them. Everything that if you did it inside the United States as a legal matter, the FBI would have to get a warrant in order to collect it. They're collecting or have collected that data. How long has it been going on? For at least 5 to 6 years in terms of their penetration. Volt Typhoon, in contrast, as I said, is really the capabilities that they're inserting inside infrastructure. Yes, it may result in collecting information, but that's not its principal objective. Volt Typhoon is intended to be inside our electric grid, our water supply systems, and in other aspects of our infrastructure in ways that, should there be a war with the United States, or the United States becomes involved in some kind of kinetic action that's related to China, they're able to turn those on, which is a version of saying they actually can turn off the capabilities and have us go dark, have us have unpurified water and all the rest in terms of the infrastructure that they've penetrated, in terms of the concerns that we would have with Volt Typhoon.
Yeah. Well, a serious threat. You mentioned conflict. before going into a little more detail on what the Chinese are up to in this area of espionage, including in the cyber domain, I did want to just pause for a moment because we have seen in the last few weeks the People's Liberation Army conducting another set of major war exercises. This one called Justice Mission 2025, probably in part a reaction to the U.S. decision to sell large numbers of weapon systems to Taiwan. Although they've been taking these activities, they've been conducting these exercises, or as Admiral Paparo has referred to them repeatedly as rehearsals for a war. Um, uh, these exercises are part of a pattern that we've seen of increasing drills, practicing isolating Taiwan, seizing key locations, integrating joint operations. What is the threat that the PLA also pose to U.S. partners in places like Taiwan right now, and how much of this is a near-term or is it a longer-term threat that they pose?
It poses both a short and a longer term threat in the sense that the PLA has been undergoing a modernization with capabilities that you often read or hear about in our media as a near peer competitor. And what that means is simply their capabilities are matching ours or nearly matching ours when it comes to military capabilities. And that, of course, is a tremendous threat to Japan and South Korea, not to mention, but I will, of course, Taiwan, in terms of this buildup of capabilities in part, and the Great Heist really does address this, in part because of stolen know-how, technology, and innovation from the United States that's been applied, with one case in point being their version of the F-35 being the FC-31, which is a mirror image that's on the cover of the book. There is a reflection of it, but also in hypersonics and in other areas. So the threat is real term. The
Yeah.
buildup in these exercises, Seth, just to put a finer point on it, are intended to prepare the PLA for what Xi Jinping has talked about, a seminal year next year, now 2027, for the reintegration of Taiwan to mainland China.
I mean, it is interesting, David. I have been out to areas like Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa, visited 7th Fleet in Yokosuka, Japan, been to Taiwan over the last year. All of the U.S. partners in this area, including actually going to Seoul, South Korea, and actually adding Canberra, Australia, so the headquarters of the Australian government, are deeply concerned about Chinese activity in the region and the Chinese buildup. In fact, I think virtually everybody now refers to China's defense buildup, which you noted earlier, as being on a wartime footing, meaning they are building the capacity in all the major domains of war, from air and maritime systems to land-based cyber, part of what we're talking about, space-based systems, nuclear weapons, to be able to deter the U.S., and if deterrence fails, to be able to fight and win a war. And so, it's a pretty urgent buildup that the Chinese are producing. But you did mention the Great Heist. Now, I do want to come back to that, which is to say, so what is the Great Heist in your view, and what is the level of urgency in doing something about it?
Well, as the FBI puts it, it could be as high as $600 billion a year in value of intellectual property rights that are stolen from our corporate sector, from our private sector, which includes, of course, government contractors that are involved in the defense industrial base in terms of capabilities. And so the Great Heist is over a number of years amounting to being the greatest transfer of wealth in history when it comes in terms of providing a bypass by the CCP to forego the kind of deep research and development at a minimum, and then the leapfrogging in terms of capabilities This would apply to everything from, as I've already said, hardware, but also software, but also in the biotech world, in all under Made in China 2025, which Xi Jinping kicked off in 2015. And so this is the acceleration of this wealth transfer that, frankly, China didn't pay for, but then is being applied to their military industrial complex that we've talked about in terms of the PLA, but also to their industrial base in terms of capabilities of selling manufactured goods that they didn't do the research and development for. For example, in the case of electric vehicles and BYD now far overtaking Tesla as an example that's provided in the book.
Yeah. So, can you talk a little about Tesla? What did the Chinese do with Tesla, and how prepared was Tesla for both assessing the degree of threat, and then what was the impact on China? Because this also gets to the strategic impetus for why the Chinese are doing this. And we'll get to this in a moment, but we'll also talk about the relationship between the Chinese government apparatus, including the MSS, as well as companies, because it's a relationship when it comes to intelligence services and companies that we just don't have anything quite like that. It's not the way our system works, for example. But Tesla first.
Sure. In 2018, the summer of 2018, Elon Musk went to Shanghai, reached an agreement, which was a very unique agreement because he wasn't required to do a joint venture. In other words, Tesla could be sole owner of the manufacturing of Tesla in China, a very appealing market of 1.4 billion people. He went in there with his expectations that by creating the plant, which started producing Teslas 1 year later, would be able to tap into that enormous market. And to some degree, he did, and has continued to do so because it's a real status symbol in China to own a Tesla. Okay, leave that aside. Mr. Chow, meanwhile, back at the ranch, we might say, he was uploading what we call the $1 billion thumb drive of the driverless car software and pass that to the Chinese. In other words, what we now see in BYD and other X and other versions of the electric vehicle market in China, organic homegrown EV market, is Tesla's driverless designs and everything that were stolen from Elon Musk. And he realized by 2019, 2020 that he had been had in terms of this upload by someone that was working on one of the most secretive portions of Tesla's efforts, notwithstanding a very open and what would appear transparent relationship with the Chinese in order to build his factory and all of that. So a very interesting relationship that while he was having the engagements with the Chinese at the highest levels of the Chinese Communist Party, they were uploading, you might even say pickpocketing his pockets from the software and technology that he was a part of bringing to China to invest in the Tesla market, and now is in their homegrown versions of electric vehicles.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the topics that you have and the areas you've talked about run the gamut. They run the gamut, as you've talked about, from Tesla and electric vehicles. You talked about the F-35, the Lockheed Martin stealth aircraft that was used by the Israelis, the Israeli version, the F-35I, in the operations last year in Iran, and the U.S. also used those F-35s in Venezuela to lay the groundwork for the special operations missions that went in to take Maduro. So there's a high value in those kinds of weapon systems, but you've also talked about some of the universities and research that's being done. So it hits multiple phases of American society. One area that we haven't touched on, I'm sort of curious what your view is when I go to some of the top movies in China right now, I see ones like Wolf Warrior 2, which is a war with the United States in Africa. It largely involves special operations forces and private military companies, but it's a direct conflict. The bad guy, the American, goes by the name Big Daddy in the movie. We've also seen the Chinese put out some very big and highly watched movies on Korea and the war in Korea, sort of a Chinese, mostly fictitious version of it. But I mean, it does look like that's an area with culture in the United States, including movies, that our movie industry has been very reticent to get into because of the Chinese market. And David, it's sort of also interesting because if we go back to the Cold War, I mean, there are countless movies where Hollywood is very comfortable with portraying the Russians as adversaries. Red Dawn, Hunt for Red October, certainly
Right.
the Nazis with all of the Indiana Jones movies. But what's going on here, to the degree that you know what's going on with the Chinese and the movie industry?
Well, I think you touched on it. It is the market. And if you think of Disney's investment in China alone, it will be reticent to do anything that might put in danger or jeopardize market access in China. And what's interesting is that when you do talk with the Hollywood people, and I've talked to a couple of them over the last couple years, they're the first to admit that China does bad things with the Uyghurs, and it does. It's an authoritarian state in that, but they're not prepared to put at risk the dollars that comes from a huge industry in terms of access to the China market. And when you think again of 1.4 billion people watching Hollywood movies, it's easier to cut out the piece or not ever put it in that would criticize the Chinese government and have it X'd out of showing in China than to just let it go forward without any criticism of China. And remember that the Chinese have been very able in their ability. They've been very good at being able to embed themselves in in American society with the Chinese message, and that is done through TikTok. It's done through other means in terms of us not seeing them as the adversary that we need to see them for.
So one question that I wanted to get back to, you mentioned it earlier, is to provide a little bit more detail, if you can, on what you call China's intelligence labyrinth, which is the Ministry of State Security. What is it? How is it structured to conduct these kinds of activities? And particularly, what else can you tell us about the 18th Bureau or the U.S. Operations Bureau, which really is focused on these kinds of activities?
So it's an organization that used to sort of be in the shadows. Today, it is a catalyst for the execution of the CCP's collection and influence operations around the globe. And so these 18 bureaus with no constraints on them and enabled by, and you made a veiled reference to it, which is the national intelligence law that was passed in 2017, that Article 7 requires that every Chinese citizen and every Chinese business entity cooperate with the CCP. And this requires a large bureaucracy to tap into that, and that is the MSS.
Yeah, and
And
if I could just read Article 7, just to put a fine point on it, all organizations and citizens shall support, assist, and cooperate with national intelligence efforts in accordance with the law, end quote. Pretty direct there.
very direct, and it really leaves no nuance to being able to say no. And if you do choose to say no, and obviously dissidents at times do, the Chinese have very effective ways of responding to that. And so the point is that the MSS in its 18 bureaus has every ability to penetrate every Chinese business as well as every joint venture that the United States or the West has in terms of joint investments in China, as well as then, as you mentioned, Bureau 18 focused on the United States. So it operates, for example, the capital investments around venture capital and private equity against companies that they either want a piece of or buy all outright in terms of Silicon Valley, in terms of early startups and that sort of stuff, where the technology and the innovation is appealing to the Chinese. Think of it this way. It's a big fish net, And if you catch it in the net, you may or may not eat it. But at some point, you'll eat some of it because you need it for the infrastructure and the build of the Chinese capabilities, even if you toss out the rest of it. In other words, it's just good investment and good betting that in Silicon Valley, you're going to pick up companies in early investment that will produce something by having a foothold in that company with a small investment, $500,000, $1 million, $10 million. And that will be enough for them to be able to have ownership rights in terms of access to the intellectual property that comes from it.
So very briefly, because we're right at the end, what do we do about it? You've talked about the 7 pillars, from protecting the crown jewels to hardening corporate front lines. What can we do to protect ourselves against the great heist, David?
So, very briefly, I think it starts with a sense of urgency. That's the chapeau over the 7 pillars. It's the need to focus on this in a material way. It's to identify the crown jewels, those things that you want to protect at all costs. Think of artificial intelligence, think of quantum, think of our biotech sector. What is it that you want to protect? This isn't about shutting down Walmart and Target from having apparel from China. This is about what you must protect for our own national security interests. What then are the legal barriers for prosecuting Chinese economic espionage? And that bar still remains too high in terms of bringing a case forward. It can take months, if not years, to prosecute someone like that when the evidence is self-evident in terms of what the Chinese were doing. It is a relationship. You mentioned academia. It's where you work with the academic institutions where the Chinese are doing advanced joint research with U.S. academia and the national laboratories. And it really is a partnership. You mentioned the Soviet Union in an era when the movies produced certain things. I'm not saying you go out there and make a bunch of anti-Chinese movies, but you do create a relationship with the private sector and the government in which you go to protect both the corporate and the public sector secrets that you must protect at all costs from them.
Yeah. Well, we have our hands full. I really appreciate how much you have laid all this out in The Great Heist. It's actually doing superbly well. I've tracked the number of people that have bought copies of it. It's well deserved. It is a phenomenal book. It's easy to read in addition to being very rich. So thank you for writing such an important book. Thanks for coming on to talk through some of these issues with us in details that I don't know that most people realize. The depth that you get into on aspects of MSS operations and the cases and how the MSS is structured is not that well known publicly. So you've done a big service in enlightening us on some of the specifics. So really appreciate you coming on, taking the time to do this, and for this whole effort on the Great Heist. It's really important to national security.
Well, thank you for giving a voice to it. And I will say, when it comes to the MSS, there's stories there that are pretty traditional in terms of recruiting spies, stuff that I used to do, all the way to digging seeds out of the ground and stealing data from Anthem Health and other aspects of it that I think will get readers quite tuned into the nature of the threat and the urgency to respond to it. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
Great. Well, thanks, David. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to our episode today. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. For more analysis, please visit csis.org. This is The Last Line of Defense.